The Drifter, an America Falls novel. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Mike Manns. Episode 6. Wolves at the Gate. Chapter 1. The look in Marley's eyes as she followed David through the opening gates was like a punch in Ragland's guts. It was the gaze of someone who has been betrayed in the worst possible way. With the knife still hard against Kit's pale and exposed throat, he took stock of the folk surrounding him, weapons drawn, and with more on the way. They looked determined to take him if they could. This wasn't a popularity contest. It was about saving the town and its legacy, and Ragland had to gamble and pray that Kit understood his gambit. "Easy does it," Ragland said, swinging Kit around as David darted behind him. Marley hissed and put her hand up. "David, wait!" The veins in David's neck were protruding, his eyes wild and wide. So close to his end goal, he wanted to kill Ragland before Marley could talk the townsfolk out of it again. The Drifter could almost smell the copper in the air, even though a drop of blood hadn't been spilled. "We gonna let the asshole get away with this, Marley?" said David, still circling. "Let's just take him." Charlie looked terrified and glanced from Ragland to Kit. "Please don't hurt her, mister." He answered, but his eyes were on Marley. "I've got one condition." Already a dozen men and women had arrived at the gate, holding a range of homemade weapons, of the bludgeoning and stabbing type, but also a few guns. All for me, Ragland thought. In truth, knowing they were willing to use weapons to defend themselves gave him a sense of relief, even though he wasn't the enemy they needed to be concerned about. "I think we're past negotiating with you," the mayor said. "Let Kit go and we won't kill you." "Can't do that." "You have no choice." David took a step closer, and Ragland swung Kit around, pressing the blade harder against her throat. He whispered sorry into her ear. Marley's hands came up again to warn David off, then she bowed her head in resignation. "I have the leverage here, Marley. For once be smart about this," said Ragland, and he began moving Kit towards the gate, pivoting her every time one of the aggressors got too close. "Fine," the mayor replied. "What's the condition?" A few angry jeers and shouts filled the street. They didn't care about reason or logic, they just wanted to kill him. "That you hear what Kit and I have to say. You make a promise to act, and then you can do what you want with me, clear?" Marley looked around at her people, who walked as one group in Ragland's wake, eyes on his knife. A familiar face appeared, pushing through the townsfolk nearest him. "Let him speak," Simon said, his thick arms folded. More angered cries, but another voice met Simon's, one Ragland had not expected to hear. "I agree with Simon." It was Claire. "Let's hear what he has to say. We owe him that." "We owe him nothing!" screamed David. He pulled up his shirt to show the townsfolk. The numbers had swollen, and now more than 30 people milled about. Soon it would be the entire town. "Look what he did, and now look at him, a knife to Kit's throat. He didn't save shit. She was just an opportunity for him, a means to a goddamn end. Ain't that right, Ragland?" Voices of agreement were in the vast majority. The thick tension filled the air. Ragland felt it. His mouth was dry, and the rapid thuds of his heart pounded in his ears. Things were getting ugly very quickly. "Why are you doing this, Ragland?" Marley asked, her voice hopeless. "Would you have let me in if I'd not grabbed Kit?" Ragland asked. She didn't answer immediately. "Would you?" "No," she said, "we wouldn't have." "So it had to be done." "Did it?" Ragland cleared his throat. "The threat is real. It's out there. We all saw it. Kit saw it. Alex saw it. They're coming, and they'll be here by tomorrow." "Where's Alex?" someone in the crowd yelled. Kit squirmed in Ragland's grasp. He knew she wanted to speak, so he loosened his grip enough. David moved his feet apart as if ready to pounce. "They killed him," Kit croaked. "Ragland's telling the truth. There are at least 200 of them. Alex, he saved us. We got away. If it wasn't for him, we'd both be dead." Ragland clenched his jaw. It was a lie. Alex had sacrificed himself to save Ragland alone. But Kit was smart enough to know this fact would possibly tip them over the edge into violence. "He's making you say this, Kit," David interrupted. "We'll get you away from him. Just tell us. Ragland killed him, didn't he?" "No, it was the cannibals. He caused a distraction and—" "Stop it," David said again. "Don't protect this man." "Shut the fuck up, David!" Kit screamed. The outburst stunned the crowd into silence, and David's mouth hung open. "You've had, the worst vendetta against Ragland since he turned up. So listen to me, all of you. This shit is super fucking real. We don't have long and—" "No!" The blow to the back of Ragland's head stunned him and sent both of them sprawling face first onto the road. Barely conscious, he realized he'd also dropped the knife and began to turn his head to see who had hit him when another blow finished the job. Everything went black. Ragland awoke. He had no idea how long he'd been out, but the agony in his head was immense. It felt like his brain had swollen to twice its size, and he had to work hard to retain consciousness. Before opening his eyes, he instinctively tried to move his hand up to touch his head, but realized they were both restrained above him. Slowly, his body sent him signals about his predicament. The biting of rope at his wrists, the frigid cold, the slick wetness on the back of his head. Gritting his teeth, he slowly opened his eyes, blinking away a flurry of fresh snowflakes and squinting as he twisted his head left and right. He was in front of the main gate. As much as he could, restricted in his movement by his tied arms, Ragland tilted his head back to check their handiwork. Over a supporting beam, the townfolk had secured a hanging rope and had hung him by the wrists. Ragland wondered then why they hadn't just killed him or thrown him into some basement somewhere. Then he had a horrible realization. They were going to use him as bait or a warning. If he was telling a lie, he would continue to hang and die within a day from exposure. If he was telling the truth, he would be the first to be killed. He wriggled and decided to try and turn himself. His feet were also tied at the ankles, but he found that if he extended them as far as possible, the toe of his boots just found purchase on the ground. As luck would have it, he had full mobility to spin, but was simply met by the wooden surface of the gate inches from his face. He turned back again and noticed a figure a short distance away, hands in their pockets, watching him. It was David. "Well done," Ragland said. "You've just killed your town. Does your dick feel big yet?" The forced chuckle introduced him to new agony as sharp pain lanced his ribs. He groaned loudly, twisting in his bonds. This drew a laugh from David. "The folk did a real number on you, Gramps. Deserved more, but Marley said we'd made our point." Ragland believed him. Now more awake, his body felt beat to hell. "Look, David, I don't give a shit if you hate me, but just arm your people and get them ready. These cannibals aren't going to come knocking politely." "Shh." David walked up to Ragland and pulled down on his legs. Ragland clenched his jaw as the rope cut into his wrists. It was all he could do not to give David the satisfaction of groaning in pain. "No, we won't be doing any of that." Ragland noticed he had a new handgun holstered on his left side and a shotgun in his right hand. An uneasy feeling filled him then. What had happened? "Where's Marley?" Ragland asked, worry overriding his pain. "What have you done?" David laughed, resting the shotgun back onto his shoulder nonchalantly. "None of your fucking business. But we've got her holed up safe. That's all you need to know." "What are you trying to pull here, dickhead?" A smirk. "That's not the way to speak to the new mayor now, is it?" "What?" "That's right, asshole. Bakerstown is under new leadership. Letting you live was the final straw for a lot of people. And when I called a vote, well, as you can see, we're under new management. Her last order was to hang you like a piñata. I wanted to kill you straight up, but I figure it's going to be a lot more fun watching you go like this, so we decided to leave you hanging." "Where's Kit?" "Oh, don't you worry about Kit," he said with a sly smile. "She's safe and sound, unlike Alex. Shame about him. I guess Kit will need a shoulder to cry on." "I don't like that tone." "Too fucking bad," David spat. He stepped close enough to Ragland so his whisper could be heard over the wind. "She's all grown up now. Maybe I'll be the lucky one to make an honest woman out of her." Ragland thrashed against the rope, and David stepped hastily away. "Settle down, Gramps. Do me a favor, be alive in the morning, and I'll tell you all about it." "You son of a bitch, get back here." David laughed and pulled the gates open, slipping inside. "Sleep tight, old man." The thought of Kit being accosted by David kept him awake for hours, but eventually the numbing freeze of the night stole him from the land of the conscious. Ragland slipped into darkness again, not knowing if he'd ever wake. Muffled voices from above and around him began to rouse him from sleep, followed very quickly by the sensation of falling. Hands caught him and eased him to the ground. It was still dark, and Ragland couldn't make out who had cut him down. "Jesus," he heard a voice whisper. "He's half dead. We've got to move, quick." "Rahul had better keep his word," another voice replied. 1, 2, 3, lift." Ragland felt his body grow weightless again as he was picked up. He tried to speak, but nothing worked. His jaw felt as though it was locked, and his throat was useless. "He will. Just move. We're screwed if we're seen," said the first voice. The second voice replied, "Yep, shit, he's heavy." Ragland listened to their voices for as long as he could, but holding on to consciousness felt like trying to grip an icy ledge over a dark chasm. Once more he tumbled into the abyss. Chapter 2. He's waking. The crackle of a fire and its incredible heat enticed Ragland to roll over to face it. He winced at the aches this drew from his body, but fire or not, he still shivered uncontrollably. Cold, he muttered, and drew the blanket tighter around himself, and tried to roll towards the flaming logs again. A hand grabbed him and rolled him back. "Steady there, old mate. You don't want to be that toasty, believe me." Ragland coughed and turned his face up to see the smiling visage of Simon. He felt a wave of emotions cascade over him. Gratitude, relief, and then dread. He sat upright with the cook's assistance. His head throbbed and his body was crying for rest, but rest would have to wait. Lamplight and the roaring fire illuminated a few dozen faces. Townsfolk, crammed into what looked like a small living room, were resting on sofa arms, the edges of tables, and even on the floor. All eyes were fixed on him. "What's going on?" Ragland asked. He shifted in an attempt to get to his numb feet, but gave up quickly. How long had he been hanging in the cold? Ragland checked the windows and noticed a thick layer of snow along the windowsills. They had almost certainly saved his life. He was sure he wouldn't have survived another hour. "A rebellion." It was Kit's voice. He looked around and she knelt by his side, putting a warm hand on his shoulder. "David's gone too far. He forced a vote, but his goons had already threatened a lot of the people who would have voted for Marley. We're not backing a bully, and with your help we'll focus on the cannibals, then deal with him." It wasn't the content of what she said that struck Ragland deeply, but the mature tone of it. She sounded different. Which, he figured, was just about right for someone who had come so close to death. Also for someone who had lost someone important to them. Ragland could see a steely resilience in her eyes. She wanted to fight. He cast his gaze around the room and recognized many of their faces. Simon was next to him, sitting on the floor. Elsewhere, he spotted Rahul, Viola, the couple from the florist shop, and a fair few more he'd worked with on the farm. Sang was there too, and that was a big deal considering he was a part of David's group. He nodded to them. "Thank you for saving me. How much time has passed since I was—" Simon gripped his shoulder. "Just a few hours. Any longer and you'd have been—" "Dead." The response came from Rahul, the stern-looking blacksmith of the town who had been tough to align with. He trusted few, and Ragland recalled he'd failed to gain that before leaving. A stoic figure, Ragland gritted his teeth and rose to his feet. Reaching out to the equally tall man, he shook Rahul's hand. "Last time I saw you, you were pointing a rifle at me. Thanks for not shooting. I'm guessing this is your place?" Rahul didn't take his eyes off Ragland. His thick brows cast a deep shadow over his brown eyes. He nodded. "Sorry about that. It was a mad rush to the gate when you and Kit showed up. Not much time for thinking, or I'm guessing Marley would have played it differently. Yeah, it's my place. Serves our purposes right now, I figure. So where's Marley?"
"David has her under house arrest," Kit replied.
She stood too and crossed her arms.
"We need to stop David and his thugs."
Ragland shook his head. "There'll be time for that, but not now." Kit frowned and shook her head.
"No, we don't know what they're doing to her."
"You saw what I saw, Kit. Saw what's coming. It'll be far worse, and we need to get ready now."
"But how are we supposed to fight off cannibals, with David and his supporters ready to shoot us in the back?"
Murmured questions filled the room. Finally able to feel his numb toes, Ragland stood and held up his hands for silence. "I'll bait them."
"Bait them? How?"
"Well, I'm assuming they've taken the school, right?" Simon jerked his head up.
"How did you know?"
He shrugged. "It's what I would have done. Central location, multiple rooms, second story. And only 2 exits that can be guarded." A man spoke up from the other side of the room. Ragland craned his head and spotted Clint, one of their teachers. Beside him stood Erica.
"It's true," Erica chimed in, "and there's a stock of food there as well."
"Perfect," Ragland said, surprised to see them both here. Apparently Marley still had a lot of respect and support in the town. "So my plan is to bait David and his followers so they don't have a choice but to join us and fight the cannibals." Many questions were fired at him at once, and he held up his hand. "I'll show you." He turned to the fire, grabbed a few small ornaments from the mantelpiece, and began setting them on the floorboards. "School, gate, stores." Everyone crowded in and stared down at his crude representation of Bakerstown. "Now, strategy is key with fewer numbers. You're going to have to dig deep, perhaps exhaust your supplies, but if you want to live, you won't have a choice." He met everyone's eyes and then was distracted by Claire standing in the doorway. Something unspoken passed between them, and she nodded. "We need to set traps. Rahul, how many do you have?" "A few bear traps and some wire snares I could set." With more time I could have done pit traps too, but the ground is too hard anyway. Ragland nodded. Get everything you have. Set them in the grass in areas running along the main road from the gate. Once they breach the gate, we go medieval on their asses and pour fuel, kerosene, oil, basically anything flammable over them and light it up. In their panic to avoid the fire, they'll branch out to the flanks, which is where the traps will come into play. Nods of approval met his plan, but Rahul held up a finger. We still don't have nearly enough for the numbers you spoke of. Not for 200. Sorry, old man. Ragland smiled. We won't need 200, but everything that can thin their numbers and make life uncomfortable for them is valuable. Now we need archers and shooters on the roofs on either side of the avenue. Start firing as soon as they are past the fire. Between the fire, the traps, and the shooters, we should have them reeling. To top it off, we need people inside the buildings that line the street with any weapons they can get their hands on to clean up stragglers looking to flank hard on either side. Our objective here is to bottleneck and hopefully do enough damage to turn them on their heels. I need one person stationed about half a mile down the road. If I've judged it right, that army will be knocking on the gates within 2 hours. And we need a signal to know when they're close. Sang, can you do that?
Sure, what signal?
Ragland pondered this for a moment. A gunshot? No, said Rahul. I have an old flare gun that'll do the job. Really? Okay, even better.
What about you? Simon inquired.
I'll be here, Ragland said, and pointed at a space between an upturned cup representing the school and the line of items representing the buildings on Main Avenue. I will set myself across the way from the school, and when we see the signal, I'll bait David and the others across into Main Avenue and lead them towards the gate. If we time it right, they'll have no option but to join our fight.
I'm coming with you, said Kit.
No, it's too dangerous.
Exactly. If you bait them, what exactly is going to stop David or one of his goons from just shooting you?
I'll be able to
outrun a bullet? Put up a hand and stop it? She crossed her arms. No, I'm coming with you, and I'll be sticking real close. He's mean and dumb, but even David's not stupid enough to risk shooting me.
He saw there was no arguing with her, and the idea actually made sense. Fine, but you'll do everything I tell you when I tell you.
Sure thing, Gramps, Kit said with a mischievous smile.
People whispered amongst themselves. Fingers pointed at the representation of Bakerstown. Ragland's eyes met with a few who looked vaguely confident, but most of them were just plain terrified. The heat of the fire at his back had done wonders to thaw out his joints. He rubbed his hands together. We have to get moving now. Simon, get the fuel and set up the trap on the gate. Rahul, get the traps placed. Viola?
You called, dearest?
Ragland smirked. Sure did. If anyone can rally people together for their positions on either side of the avenue, it'll be you. If you think he can be trusted, you should warn your brother Travis and tell him to watch for the flare. Only if you think he can be trusted not to spill his guts to David, though. She nodded gravely. All right, come on, everyone, let's get to it. Come on. Rahul's small house filled with the scutter of feet as people dispersed, readying themselves for what Ragland felt would be a bloody battle. Most of them didn't know it yet, but they were about to face the biggest test of their lives. He looked back down at the representation of the town, checking to see if he had missed anything, when Rahul handed him a 12-gauge shotgun that looked like it was fresh out of the box, along with a box of shells. Here, he said. I've been saving it for a rainy day. He paused. Or snowy. Kit sidled up to them and admired it.
Wow, Rahul, this is like the prettiest thing I've seen. Did you give it a name?
No. Ragland pumped it just to ensure the chamber remained empty. He trusted Rahul, but he'd promised himself a long time ago to be almost religious with his gun etiquette. Very nice. Hope you don't need it, but when you're done I'd like her back. I'm attached to the old girl. Ragland chuckled. Thought you didn't name guns. I don't, but this one has always been a she. Kit nodded in approval.
Nice.
Time to go, Kit. Is it as bad as you say? Rahul asked. Ragland nodded. Worse, Rahul. Just do what you can. The blacksmith cracked his knuckles and gestured to his hammer leaning against the mantelpiece. I plan to. The sun, just beginning to peek over the horizon, was hidden behind heavy gray clouds. It aided Kit and Ragland as they skirted the edges of buildings, keeping to the shadows and out of sight. He had his bow over his shoulder and the shotgun in hand. Kit had her bow. Before they had set out, Kit had urged Ragland to have a mug of the coffee Simon brewed after they had decided on their course of action. He didn't have to be asked twice. The steaming black liquid worked its magic within a few minutes, and he felt energy wash away the ravages of the frozen night. As they made their way up the main avenue, Ragland spotted their people on either side getting into place. They were quiet and efficient, and unless someone was specifically looking, they wouldn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Ragland finally ushered Kit into the alley that cut through to 2nd Street and the vacant block opposite the school. In the shadows of the temporary shelters that were used to cover street stalls for the markets there every Saturday, they settled down to wait. "I need you to know things are going to get ugly," he said to her.
"I know that, old man. I'm still here, right?"
"Yes, but we might have to do some ugly things to get the rest of the town to follow." Kit took a deep breath.
"I'm not sitting back idle and letting Alex's sacrifice mean nothing. If that means we have to kill David or someone else I know, then so be it."
"Good," he nodded. Ragland looked back to Main Avenue and spied shapes on the roofs of the stores and a couple of shadows in windows. The preparation seemed to be going smoothly. Kit leaned over to him.
"How are we going to lure—"
Almost as if she'd been overheard, the main doors to the schoolhouse opened, and David stepped out with Travis and Blackbeard and another man whose name Ragland didn't know. The men were talking quietly, their breath pluming in the cold morning air. 3 doors down from where Ragland and Kit waited, a figure emerged from Jack's butcher shop. It was Viola. She stepped out onto the sidewalk and began walking confidently towards the 4 men. She was within 10 feet and had called out to her brother when a flare shot into the air, casting them all in a brief crimson glow. "What the hell?" he heard David say. There was nothing for it. Now was the time. He turned to Kit. "Okay, let's make ourselves known. When I say run, we run, and we don't stop, got it?"
"Got it."
With Kit following, Ragland stood up and strode into the middle of the road and bellowed at the top of his lungs. "Should have made the knot tighter, David." Stunned, David, Travis, and the other 2 turned to the pair in the street. Then David began fumbling for his pistol. Ragland raised his shotgun and Kit her bow, an arrow nocked in at the ready. The school door opened and more of the townsfolk spilled out, all holding weapons and curious about the commotion. The flare faded out and Ragland fancied he heard roars and yells on the wind. "Maybe you best finish the job," Ragland called and pumped a shell into the chamber before firing over their heads. David and the rest ducked for cover, some scrambling back inside. He saw Viola rush to Travis and whisper something harshly in his ear. There was no time to wait for his response. "Run, Kit!" Ragland yelled and bolted into the alley with Kit hot on his heels. "After them!" roared David. Chapter 3. Chests heaving and legs and arms pumping, Kit and Ragland tore through to Main Avenue. Kit's idea to stay close had been a good one. Even David wasn't willing to take a shot for risk of hitting her. They would chase until they could get their hands on them. Ragland just had to hope that by that time the horde would be on their way to the gate. He needn't have worried. He heard the roaring and baying of the mad army a second before Kit called, "They're already here!" They rounded the final bend to the gate, and in the distance he saw Charlie and Rufus sending arrow after arrow into the baying crowd beyond the gate. Despite their best efforts, the gates were bulging inwards. Large pieces of it had been hacked away by axes, and in the jagged holes feral zombs tried to claw their way through, while their masters continued to work at the gate. Clint, the mild-mannered teacher, came from nowhere and began hacking with a tomahawk at the scrawny arms reaching through the gaps. He was screaming with anger and had some success, leaving the ground around him splattered with blood and fingers and hands, until a plank above him broke inward, and a zom, wild with hunger, squeezed through, landing on Clint's shoulders and tearing out his throat with a vicious jerk of its head. Blood spurted into the air as the big man fell to his knees, the cannibal still on him, its mouth full of flesh. "No!" Kit cried, sending an arrow clean through the air and into the cannibal's flank, eliciting a squeal of agony. "Stop now!" yelled a voice behind them, followed by a loud gunshot. Ragland put his hands up and, with Kit, turned as David and his enormous number of followers stalked towards them, clearly unaware of what was just around the bend, although some looked curiously at each other, trying to work out what the din coming from the gate meant. Only a few had guns. If he didn't resolve this quickly, his worst fears had come true, and all of them would be fodder for what was about to come through the gate. "They're here! Can't you hear?" Ragland roared, and began walking backwards towards the gate, as they rushed towards him. Finally, in sight of the gate, the group halted.
"Oh my God!"
a woman screamed, pointing at the dying teacher. "You let this happen, David, but it's up to you all now to fight." The blood had drained from David's face, and he flinched as an almighty blow impacted the gate. It was followed quickly by another as a zom slithered through the widening gap and bounded on all fours towards Ragland and Kit. Kit's scream gave Ragland enough time to whirl around and fire the shotgun. It took the zom in the throat, blowing its head clean off, the carcass crumpling into a heap at his feet, as the head rolled across the road, coming to rest at David's feet. One of the men vomited violently as their leader's mouth hung open. "Believe us now?" He stuttered. "This can't—" Before he could get another word out, another boom rocked the gate, this time sending what was left of the heavy doors crashing inward. The gates of Bakerstown were breached, and leading the charge into the town were the feral, deliberately starved Zoms. "Now!" roared Simon. "Move back!" Ragland shouted as he and Kit ran back towards their erstwhile pursuers. David and those of his group that hadn't yet run saw what was happening as Simon, Charlie, and Rufus began tipping buckets of fuel and oil off the wall and over the invaders, dousing a dozen or more below. The cannibals coughed, choked, and staggered away as Simon dropped a wad of burning cloth onto the soaked ground under the archway. With a whomp, flames shot up and engulfed them all, pursuing the ones not immediately consumed like a vengeful monster. The air was filled with screams and the stench of burning flesh. All too soon, the flames died down and more cannibals of both types replaced the ones who had been neutralized. "Shit!" Kit screamed and began firing her arrows. "Fight!" Ragland cried at the top of his lungs, and charged forward, blowing a hole through the chest of a cannibal, making a beeline for Kit. Another, this one tall and carrying a rifle, ran at him while raising the weapon, but Ragland beat him to the shot, blowing out his kneecap and smashing the butt of his shotgun into his face as he fell. He had barely swung around when something heavy crashed into him from behind, knocking him to the ground and the air from his lungs. "Meat!" screamed his scrawny but powerful assailant, his rotten breath warm and foul on Ragland's face. It was all he could do to keep the man's serrated teeth from his neck as he wrestled fruitlessly trying to free the shotgun. His attacker smiled as he slowly won the tussle, his teeth inching closer to Ragland's vulnerable throat, when suddenly a piece of metal sprouted from his mouth, then vanished just as quickly. The cannibal gurgled, then collapsed on top of him. Ragland groaned, rolled the body off him, and stood up to discover a pale David holding a long bloody knife in his hand. "Thank you." David didn't answer. He was now apparently occupied with a singular goal, and just turned to shoot and cut at more cannibals as they poured into the town. More fights were breaking out around him as David's followers, including Blackbeard and Travis, joined the fight for their town, mowing down cannibals with their guns. To his left, he heard the sharp snap of metal followed by a horrible scream, and turned to see a cannibal writhing on the ground, clutching the stump of their leg, the remains from the shin down clamped in a bear trap. A gore-covered Rahul appeared next to him, obliterating the face of another Zom with his big hammer, before he pointed to the rooftops. Ragland followed his gaze and saw Viola and a line of others, even Odin, readying their arrows. It was time for the third prong of their defense. "Fall back! Fall back!" The townsfolk turned to run. Ragland turned to make sure they had everyone and saw Charlie, Rufus, and Simon sprinting from the shadows after coming back down the ladders. The flow of cannibals had slowed as they became more circumspect about the danger inside the gates, and the little group were almost to him, Simon in front, followed by Charlie and Rufus 10 feet behind. The boys were whooping, clearly invigorated by the fight and their part in it, when Rufus tripped over the arm of a charred corpse. Charlie ran on before he realized, then turned back. "No!" Ragland screamed. "Keep going! I'll get him!" Charlie didn't listen, running back and reaching down for Rufus, who looked up thankfully and took his hand. The expression on his face didn't change when the arrow thudded into the back of his skull. Charlie screamed as his dead friend's hand slipped from his, and Ragland let off a shot in the direction the arrow had come from. He reached Charlie and grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. The hysterical kid fought him and tried to get Rufus up. Ragland's heart sank. He had anticipated casualties, but seeing the familiar face of one so young dead on the ground shook him to the core. "Charlie!" he shouted, tugging him. The young boy, his face stained with tears, jerked himself away eventually, as another arrow whizzed by. Ragland pulled him along, and they retreated up the avenue, weaving side to side to make themselves less of a target. Chapter 4. Ragland, Charlie, Kit, and a handful of others broke into an abandoned store, still a full block and 50 yards short of the school, and began shooting through windows at the cannibals running up the avenue. The sight unnerved him, but it was 100 times worse for the Bakerstown natives. Terror and the vigorous desperation to survive was etched on their faces, but out in the streets, the cannibals armed and in survival gear, the Norms who egged on the Zoms, walked with a fearlessness that felt inhuman. Even as volleys of arrows from the rooftops cut their numbers down, they continued on. Charlie echoed his thoughts. They keep coming," he whimpered. "They're not human." "They are," Ragland replied as he blew away a Zom who strayed too near to the building. "And they die like humans." There was a scream from a building opposite as a group of Norms kicked down the door. Kit took one with an arrow between the shoulder blades, but the other 3 entered and more screams ensued. A body crashed to the road and lay still on the sidewalk like a rag doll, its head at an unnatural angle. It was Jenny, the archivist. There were cries of horror from the people around him. Ragland turned to Kit, who was ghostly pale, her eyes furtive and wild. The death of Jenny inspired fierce gunfire from the other locals on the rooftops and a handful still on the street, including David and Rahul. The blacksmith swung his hammer like a demon, caving in the heads of any dumb or careless enough to come within range. Momentarily, the enemy was pushed back. "We have to get to the school. Are you all ready?" Most of them nodded. "Then let's go. Keep low, follow me." At the back of the store, he knocked open the door, and the small band fled down the back alleyway to a vacant lot that was now used as a marketplace each Saturday. They sheltered under the rickety canvas-covered stalls while Ragland surveyed their next move. A lone Zom cannibal appeared ahead, and Ragland dropped it with an arrow into the eye. No more appeared. "Go!" Ragland led the way, plucking the arrow from the corpse as he went and knocking it again as they emerged on 2nd Street. The school was now just a 50-yard sprint.
I don't think I can."
Ragland turned to see one of the younger townsfolk had fallen to his knees. He didn't recognize the man who stared out across the open street toward the school. Kit put a hand on his shoulder.
"Callum, you can do this. Think about Melissa. Think about your friends, Casey and Fred. They're all there waiting for you."
In the distance, a shrill scream interrupted her, followed quickly by a burst of gunfire. The man flinched and shot to his feet, ready to flee.
"No,
Kit slapped him hard across the cheek.
Pull it together!"
The young man put a hand on his cheek and looked at her with wide eyes. Finally, he nodded, and Kit turned to Ragland.
"Let's do this."
Ragland nodded. "When I move, follow me and stay low." The group ran from under the shelter and across the open tarmac, their feet crunching on a scum of dirty snow. There were yells and screeches behind them. They'd been spotted and the chase was on. Kit and Ragland paused to loose a few arrows at the cannibals emerging from the abandoned marketplace they'd just left. "Run!" Ragland urged. The schoolhouse now just a clear run across the square. Battle cries behind them elicited screams and swearing from their small group, and they broke formation and scattered, their sole destination the school. Ragland was ahead next to Charlie, with Kit just behind them. The rest lagged behind, unable to keep up. As he flew over the icy lawn, Ragland turned his shoulder and charged into the closed doors, knocking them open with a tremendous crash. He was met by the stunned expressions and raised weapons of the townsfolk inside. "Wait, it's us. Get ready to barricade this door." Ragland turned and ushered everyone through, yelling encouragement. Callum was the straggler of the group and a good 5 paces behind the next to last, but his terrified face relaxed when he began to climb the steps to Ragland. There was a crack of gunfire from further down the street, and suddenly Callum lurched, clawing the air and stumbling through the doorway and into Ragland's arms. His dead weight took them both to the floor. Screams and shrieks grew louder, and more gunfire blew splinters from the wall around the doorway. "The doors!" Ragland screamed, pushing Callum off and dragging him into the corridor. Simon and Kit slammed the doors shut, while Jack and Erica slid a heavy side table against it. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would buy them time. Ragland faced his fellow survivors, all worn and exhausted. Kit went to Callum and put 2 fingers against his throat before shaking her head. Someone passed her a shirt, which she placed over his face. "What now?" Simon asked. "We try and break down their numbers. Everyone with a bow take the top floor windows and give them hell. Anyone else with a working gun move desks out into the corridors for cover and stand your ground. Only fire when you have a clear shot." "And us?" Simon asked, raising the wood axe in his hand. "When they come through, we'll engage them at close quarters." As if on cue, thunderous and persistent banging on the doors began. There was a commotion at the rear end of the corridor, and everyone tensed. Ragland stepping forward with his shotgun ready. "It's just us." It was Marley and David, the latter coated in blood. Kit rushed forward and hugged Marley, who was holding her trusty shotgun. "How?" Marley shot David a look that said there'd be a reckoning at some point.
"David, let me out. No time for the whys and wherefores now. What's the situation here, Ragland?"
"Guns on the lower floors, archers in the top windows. Anyone with a melee weapon will hold back and assist with barricades and wounded. Until, of course, we all have to get our hands dirty." "What about the back doors?" David cleared his throat, his pride all but gone. "Barricaded." "Great," Charlie said from behind Ragland, his eyes on the front doors that trembled with heavy blows and had begun to buckle inward. "So we're trapped." "This is our best bet," said Ragland. "Out in the open they can separate us like cattle. It might have been different if we'd prepared, but—" He left the thought unspoken. Marley looked down sadly at Callum's body and then to Ragland.
"I'm sorry."
Ragland locked his eyes on her. "Too late for regrets now. Let's just do what needs to be done, and hopefully you'll have some pieces of this town left to put back together."
"Right," Marley said,
taking the hit on the chin. He knew it had stung, but she had the stern, narrowed look of someone keen to rectify her mistakes. So did David. "Where's Rahul?" "I tried to bring him with me," said David, "but he's in some sort of battle-lust trance. Last I saw he was charging towards the gate." Behind them there was a loud crack and the doors pushed inwards a little. There was a short reprieve, accompanied by thuds and thunks and the screams of the enemy, as a volley of arrows from the top windows rained down on the cannibals trying to knock the doors open. A burst of automatic gunfire put an end to the reprieve. "Break down that fucking door!" roared a commanding voice. The doors bulged, finally exploding inwards, sending the table that had been pushed against it and other debris flying. Feral Zom cannibals scampered over the debris and launched themselves at the defenders. Simon's axe met the first one, splitting the creature's head straight down to the neck. The cannibal fell, and then they were all fighting for their lives. Chapter 5. Ragland's face and beard were hot and wet with blood minutes later as he surveyed the scene. They had been forced deep into the corridor, but had held off the onslaught. Around them and all the way to the front door, the floor was littered with corpses of the feral shock troops. While their swarming attacks had been effective in the open, the Zoms had not been so effective against a determined, well-armed enemy in confined spaces. Bent over and heaving air into his lungs, he evaluated the other survivors and shared a brief look with Kit, who looked as tired as him and the rest. The onyx necklace had been shaken free of her shirt during the struggles, and the sight of it gave him strength. "If you have any ammo left, reload," he called, but a shadow darkened the doorway as he jammed 2 more shells into his gun. Ragland turned and recognized the cannibal leader holding a military rifle loosely in one hand. His stance was non-threatening.
"Ah, the one that got away," said the leader in a sing-song voice.
Ragland held up his hand to indicate his group should hold fire. He was curious to hear what he had to say. Charlie missed the signal or ignored it, and let an arrow loose from the stairway to their left. It embedded itself in the doorframe barely 8 inches from the cannibal leader's head. He looked at the arrow and smiled.
"I come to parley and you shoot at me?"
Ragland slowly raised his shotgun until it was pointing at the cannibal's belly. "Say your piece, then."
"All right, here's my offer. If you surrender now, I'll let the women and children live. You've lost one way or the other, but at least this way there'll be some survivors, and we won't have to spend weeks plucking bullets from carcasses."
Ragland replied by pumping his shotgun. Without taking his eyes off the leader, he addressed the people behind him. "Fall back down the corridor. To the gymnasium. I'll be right behind you." "No, Ragland, I don't think so," David said, stepping up on his right. Simon, too, stepped up on his left, axe in one hand and a small snub-nosed pistol in the other. "Yep, no can do," he agreed. "He'll have to come through all of us." Ragland didn't have time to argue, let alone ask the Canadian where the hell he'd gotten that pistol. "Marley, Kit, take the others. Hold the gymnasium."
"Ragland, we're not going—"
"Do it!" he yelled without looking back, his attention focused on the leader. A gentle hand fell on his shoulder. It was Marley.
"Don't die for my mistakes, Joshua."
Her use of his first name shocked him. It felt personal. "I won't," he said softly. "Keep them safe." The leader laughed at the display of affection and calm words. Beneath his heavy brow, his eyes glinted with aggression and hunger for death. This man was ready to kill. So was Ragland. The cannibal nodded to someone just out of sight and raised his weapon. "Fire!" The corridor descended into chaos as bullets and arrows ripped through the space. Pulverized wood and plaster flew from the walls and ceiling. Ragland crouched behind a stack of overturned lockers. Simon and David did the same on the other side. The leader scurried out of the doorway after unleashing a volley of bullets, the first time Ragland had seen him show any urgency. "I'm out," called Simon, and others responded in kind. The drifter began to reload, but knew a sustained push by the cannibals would probably overwhelm them. Ragland heard screams of attack and meat outside as he pumped the shotgun. Swarms of armed cannibal men and women, a mix of Zoms and Norms, rushed in through the door. "Retreat!" Ragland yelled as he and David fired into the front runners. 4 cannibals went down, slowing the others. David walked backwards, shooting and following his retreating people.
"Hold the big one for me,"
the booming voice of the leader called as he entered the hallway, his rifle at his shoulder. David put down 2 more, but Ragland needed to reload. "Keep going," he called to David as a bullet whizzed by his head. He ran through the open doorway to his left. It was Erica's classroom. He shut and locked the door and rested his back against it as he pulled 2 more shells from the rapidly dwindling supply in his pocket. Freshly reloaded, he pumped the shotgun and turned to face the small square window in the door. The leader was leering in at him. They fired simultaneously. The cannibal's round pierced the door in a spray of splinters and hit him in the thigh, while his blasted a large hole in the door, catching the leader in the upper right arm. Ragland reeled back, clutching his thigh as the door was kicked in. Another round hit him in the shoulder. He fell back onto a kid's desk as his shotgun clattered to the timber floor. The drifter pushed against the desk and turned, wincing in pain as he put weight on his wounded leg, but he was determined to stand tall as he faced death. The pentagram carved into the leader's forehead stood out starkly against his pale, pained face. His right arm was a bloody mess, but he had switched the rifle to his left and held it one-handed, finger on the trigger. Ragland stared defiantly at the cannibal, who forced a smile as he aimed the barrel of the weapon at his face. The dry click of the empty magazine saw the smile fade as quickly as it had appeared, and with the reprieve, Ragland lunged at him. The cannibal leader could do little to avoid Ragland, but managed to raise his knee and bury it into his side, knocking the wind out of him. They fell to the floor, with the leader managing to roll on top of Ragland, bringing his rifle around and jamming the still warm barrel against his throat, pressing it down with his good hand and the elbow of his mangled arm. Blood splattered Ragland as he attempted to push the weapon off his throat with his good arm. It was no use. The cannibal had the ascendancy, and his 2 wounds meant Ragland didn't have the strength to fight him off. Black motes began to swim in his vision as his eyeballs bulged. The gunmetal slowly crushed his larynx. The leader's eyes glared at him, ravenous and determined, his blood-stained sharpened teeth bared by his rictus sneer. "Oh, yes," said the cannibal as he saw the light in his victim's eyes begin to fade. "I'm going to enjoy eating your girl, the one you care for, so young, so lean. She'll be a meal to savor." Rage ignited in Ragland's fading consciousness. With a supreme effort, he rolled his hips, slightly unbalancing the cannibal, and smashed his knee up between his legs. The leader screamed, and the pressure on his throat eased. Seizing the moment, Ragland reached up, put a big hand over the back of the cannibal's head, and pulled it down as he propelled his own head upward, his forehead savagely meeting it. The cannibal's nose shattered with a loud crunch, and he fell off Ragland, clutching his face, blood pouring through his fingers. The drifter clambered to his feet, his head reeling, and took a moment to steady himself. Too late, the dazed cannibal grasped the threat of the man standing over him, and he used his good arm to try and get up, but slipped on his own blood, falling to his side and holding up a hand for mercy. "No mercy for you," grated Ragland before kicking the cannibal in the jaw with his steel-capped boot. The gargled scream through his broken jaw was surprisingly loud, and as he rolled away clutching his ruined face, Ragland picked up the rifle, gripped it by the barrel, and smashed the stock over the back of the leader's skull. The man collapsed face first into the floor, moaning. Ragland struck him again. The moaning stopped, then again and again and again, until the man's head was an unrecognizable pulpy mess. Ragland stopped finally, then leaned on the bloody rifle, heaving deep breaths, wiping sweat and blood from his eyes. Distant screams and a gunshot sent a shot of adrenaline through him. Kit. Unarmed except for his knife, drained of energy and wounded, Ragland staggered down the blood-soaked corridor to the rear of the school and the gymnasium. Bodies and parts were strewn everywhere. Most of the dead were cannibals, but a well of sadness opened when he saw the butcher, Jack, dead with a meat cleaver embedded in his chest. Next to him lay a girl he didn't recognize, missing an arm. Bastards. The heavy double doors to the gymnasium were closed, and a skinny cannibal, naked from the waist up with a badly broken leg, was struggling to push them open. Ragland stepped up to him, put the knife against the back of his neck, and slid it between the wretch's C3 and C4 vertebrae. He fell to the floor without so much as a sigh, and the drifter put his good shoulder against the doors and pushed, struggling to move the dead weight behind it. He fell through the opening onto the dead bodies of the fallen cannibals and locals, then struggled to his feet as he took in the scene before him. Up in the bleachers he saw Viola, her face drained and holding her bloody side. Next to her, David aimed at the small crowd on the floor of the gym, trying to get a clear shot. Ragland followed his gaze and saw a stunning sight. It was the giant cannibal whose twin he'd killed barely 2 weeks before. He was the eye of a storm. The bodies of townspeople and other cannibals alike lay around him like wheat that had been scythed. In one hand he wielded a baseball bat wrapped tightly in barbed wire, in the other an axe. The cannibal was surrounded, but had evened the odds rapidly. Near the basketball hoop, Ragland spied Kit, who, like David, was trying to get a shot with what looked to be her last arrow. Closer in was Marley, who swung an inadequate broomstick bravely but ineffectually. Simon, Charlie, Blackbeard, and several others harried the giant with handheld weapons. "Give me a shot!" Kit yelled. But the remaining defenders darting this way and that to stay out of his long reach meant it was all but impossible. Simon, to the giant's left, ducked beneath a swinging blow of his axe and lunged, burying his own small axe into the giant's left arm. The cannibal howled and swung the bat at the already retreating cook, striking him hard in the chest and sending him soaring and crashing into the front row seats. "No!" Ragland cried. Everyone froze and looked over at him as his wounded leg gave way. The cannibal shot him a shark's grin. "Ah, it's you again. Fight gone out of you, eh? I will enjoy this." The words weren't quite out of his mouth when Blackbeard, taking advantage of the distraction, darted in, slashing his knife at the cannibal's lower back. The cannibal dodged it and turned, and with a downward swing of his axe cleaved David's lieutenant's head open to the bridge of his nose. The big Bakerstown local collapsed to the floor, his dead weight pulling the axe handle from the giant's grip. Blackbeard's gruesome sacrifice gave Kit the opening she needed, and she released her arrow. It whistled through the air and struck the cannibal just below his left shoulder blade. He shrieked and spun around, pawing at the arrow as he looked for his tormentor. He saw Kit and forgot about the arrow. "You!" he growled. "I'll eat you alive!" Kit let her bow fall from her shoulder and pulled a knife from her boot as he charged. Marley tried to block him, but he palmed her away, sending her hard onto her back and skidding over the polished floorboards, now slick with blood. "Kit!" Ragland gasped, watching on helplessly. The giant swung the deadly bat in a big, overhanded arc, but the nimble girl evaded it, stepping lightly to the side. The giant swung again and she ducked away, the base of the bat missing her face by a mere inch. David attempted another shot from the bleachers but missed, and the giant swung again and again, becoming frustrated at the elusive girl. Clearly tiring with the effort, Ragland saw blood dripping from his mouth, and knew the arrow deep in his back had almost certainly pierced a lung. Then, with a final lunge, Kit ducked under another wild swing of the bat, and with a move Ragland had shown her, stepped in close to his unprotected flank, and buried her knife to the hilt just under the giant's ribcage. Like quickfire, she pulled it free and danced away, slicing his thigh as she went. David, Marley, Ragland, and the rest watched in awe as the gigantic cannibal fell to one knee, clutching the open wound in his belly. He lifted the bat one more time and swung weakly at his tiny tormentor. He missed, and as he tried to catch his balance, Kit darted in and with a wicked full-armed swing, sliced the man's throat open. Kit rolled away from him as he dropped the bat and clutched at the mortal wound, the blood pouring from the wide gash and already pooling in a red lake beneath him. 5 seconds later, like a felled oak, he crashed face first onto the floor and didn't move again. Kit stood panting, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off, and looked over to the drifter where he lay prone on the bodies of the dead. "Ragland!" she cried, and ran towards him. She was only 3 feet away when a hand surfaced from the pile of bodies and grabbed her ankle. Her mouth was a perfect O of surprise as she fell, and the concealed cannibal lunged and grabbed her hair, ripping her head back to expose her throat. Ragland saw the glint of a blade in its hand. Kit flinched, but suddenly the cannibal squawked briefly and fell onto her, his eyes lifeless. There was an arrow embedded in the back of his skull. Confused, she turned to the doors, as did the quickly fading Ragland and the rest of the survivors. Alex, one side of his scalp and face coated in blood, but looking as alive as she could ever remember, lowered his bow and looked around, slowly taking in the carnage. "Alex!" Kit screamed as she clambered out from under the cannibal and rushed over to him, nearly knocking him off his feet. "Did I miss much?" he said, smiling and rubbing her back. "A whole lot," she said, pulling away and looking into his face. "But I can't fault your timing." Ragland grinned through the pain. As far as surprised went, it didn't get much better than Alex appearing alive and well in time to save his love. He began to climb to his feet again when a wave of nausea knocked him back on his haunches. "Shit, Ragland!" Kit, with Alex trailing her, rushed over to him. She knelt at Ragland's side, quickly inspecting his wounds. "We need to find Claire," she cried. "He's been shot." "I saw her down the street. She and a few others are helping the wounded." "The cannibals?" Ragland gasped. "Dead or fleeing. The fight went out of them when one came out screaming about the leader being dead." Ragland nodded. "I'll get Claire," he said, and gently squeezed Ragland's shoulder. "It's good to see you again, old man." His mouth opened to speak, but instead his eyeballs rolled up in his head. "He's passed out, hurry," said Kit. Ragland drifted out of unconsciousness once. The world was swaying gently, and Claire's beautiful face hovered above his. "Well done, cowboy. We've got you now," she said with a smile, before everything faded to black again. Chapter 6. Ragland sat on the wooden porch outside Marley's house, soaking in the afternoon sun. It was a clear day, but the faint smell of smoke tickled his nostrils. He ached all over, and the bandages over and around his wounds pinched. Both hands were wrapped tight around a mug of coffee, and he sipped the scalding black liquid gingerly. Footsteps creaked behind him.
"Morning, sunshine. Touch and go yesterday. How are you feeling now?"
Marley sat down beside Ragland on the bench and took a sip of her own coffee.
"You reckon this is the last of Simon's batch?"
Ragland asked, deflecting.
"Probably," she said.
"Shame. How is he?"
"Bruised and punctured. 2 broken ribs, according to Claire. And he needed some stitches where the barbed wire tore his skin."
Ragland shook his head.
"Must be a tough bastard. That would have killed a lesser man. What about you? That was quite the hit you took."
Marley lifted a thigh and patted her rump.
"Lucky I have plenty of padding. Just a bump on my head."
This drew a chuckle from Ragland, and he realized it was the first time he'd laughed in at least a week. The two settled into an easy silence. After a few minutes, Marley put a hand on his leg.
We owe you a debt, Ragland, and an apology. You were right all along, and I was stupid to think we could negotiate our way out of a fight. We'll never be able to repay you."
He shook his head.
"No need." "I mean it. I want to repay you."
He sighed and looked down into the black liquid as he swirled it gently.
"Just rebuild. Live like you have been, but be ready. We don't live in an ideal world anymore, no matter how much time goes by and makes you think it's okay. There's death around every corner. You need to lead your people through it and not bury your head in the sand."
"Well, the thing is," she said, "I don't see the town accepting me as leader again. They followed me all these years, put their lives in my hands, but my failure to see the danger of the cannibals and letting David pull the wool over my eyes means I lost their faith. David agreed to step down so there can be another proper vote in a month, but how can I rebuild that trust before then?"
"One day at a time."
He took a deeper swig of his coffee, turned, and was shocked to see tears falling down the mare's face.
"I was so desperate to believe the world outside didn't exist anymore." "Then I came knocking to remind you,"
Ragland replied grimly.
"Don't blame yourself for wishing the world a better place. What's done is done."
"I suppose."
"They won't forgive quickly, nor will they forget, but if you're patient and follow your common sense, you will win them back."
Marley wiped her face with the back of her sleeve.
"I probably don't deserve it, but I'll try. I believe in Bakerstown." "Good."
They sat and talked until well after their coffee was finished. Marley told him about the cleanup they'd started yesterday, piling the cannibal corpses and burning them through the night.
"What about the dead townsfolk?"
Marley's eyes misted again.
"They'll be buried over the next few days, and then we're having a memorial for everyone in a week."
Ragland nodded, then rose slowly, using the crutch Rahul had fashioned him for his recuperation.
"Thanks again for having me. Your place sure beats the creaky as a recovery room. I'm going to lay down again. Doctor's orders, you know."
Marley laughed gently.
"Take all the time you need. I'm not kicking you out ever again."
His shoulder healed more quickly than his thigh, but within a week he was able to walk without the crutch and was only left with a slight limp.
"You're lucky the bullet flattened out when it passed through the door. It was messy, but stopped short of bone and nerves,"
Claire said, doing a final check of the leg wound which had crusted over nicely. He had made his way over to her office without the crutch.
"You're also lucky that the bullet to the shoulder went straight through the deltoid. Only missed your joint by a matter of half an inch."
"Yep, lucky me," he said wryly. She laughed and turned away to throw the old dressings in the trash can.
"So, what are your plans?"
she asked quietly, still facing away from him. He didn't answer for a few beats, suddenly feeling like an awkward teenager.
"I guess if you give me the go-ahead, I'll head out day after tomorrow."
Her shoulders were stiff as she turned back around.
"Oh, sure. You're good to go if that's what you want."
He didn't know how to read her. Her tone was offended, but her words were encouraging.
"Okay, good. Claire."
"Yep, good. Okay, well, I have stuff to do." He shook his head, puzzled.
"Okay, I guess I'll see you later."
"Maybe," she said flatly. Odin, alongside David, who seemed to have had a genuine turnaround, fashioned a series of crosses to mark those who had fallen in defense of Bakerstown. There were too many for the small graveyard. Too many for such a small town to have to bear. Rahul melted down scrap metal and cast nameplates for every single cross, and when it was all done, Ragland walked the rows with all the townsfolk on the day of the memorial. Marley's eulogy mentioned every one of the dead by name. She was eloquent and passionate, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house by the time she'd finished. Ragland knew with that one speech she'd done a lot to restore the faith she had been certain was gone forever. There was a large outdoor celebration afterwards. Beer and moonshine flowed, but Ragland made his way out of the warmth and light to walk the empty streets. With his thick coat drawn tight, Ragland found the florist Fred sweeping snow from the door. The man nodded, but there was no smile forthcoming. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. "I wanted to ask how you were." Fred shrugged, his gaze frozen on a patch of the road next to Ragland. "Not great. Casey's gone. She was my world. I don't—" He stopped and his eyes welled up. Ragland put a hand on the man's shoulder. "I'm sorry for your loss, Fred. Whatever you do, don't stop what you have here. The flowers. We all need that something extra to give our lives color again, and you and Casey brought a lot of color to this town, not just with flowers." "Yeah, you're right," Fred said, wiping his eyes. "So where are you headed after? Don't suppose you care to stay behind?" "No," Ragland replied. "My place is on the road." "Does it have to be? I know a certain someone who I suspect would like to see you stay." Ragland looked at him curiously. "Maybe so," he said gruffly, "but Kit will forget me after a while. She's young." "Oh, it wasn't Kit I was talking about. Never mind me, I'm just being an old gossip. Have a good night." With that he turned around and headed back inside, leaving Ragland with an eyebrow raised, staring after him. After the discussion, Ragland made his way back to the noise of the celebrations. The question of Claire was playing on his mind, and he wasn't comfortable leaving the next morning on the note they'd finished on. Was it her that Fred had been referring to? The first group he saw was a bunch of familiar faces, the ones he'd begun to think of as the leadership group of the town. A sore and sorry Simon, Kit and Alex, Marley and Rahul. Missing was Claire, Viola, still recovering at home from a shallow stab wound, and thankfully David. Ragland wasn't ready to forgive past transgressions as easily as some of the others. The group was in good spirits, fueled somewhat, he suspected, by alcohol. "Joshua," Marley called, "come join us." Still not in the mood for partying, he reluctantly joined them and accepted the tankard of beer that was thrust into his hand. "Go on, Alex, tell us the end of the story." "Well, you kind of know the rest. I rode in on a white horse and saved the damsel in distress." There was laughter all around, but Kit, who had observed Ragland's troubled face by the firelight, elbowed him. "Finish it properly." Alex sobered. "Sure. Well, I told you how they captured me. I got clubbed over the head. When I woke up, I was slung over the back of a horse and we were on the move. I guess I'm lucky they were after you almost right away. It meant they didn't have time to make a meal out of me. When they attacked, they left me near the rear tied to a tree. Stupid them, they didn't save any for a second wave. They just went all in. Cocky, I guess. It took me an age, but finally I worked my way out of the ropes and freed myself. The fighting was mostly done by then. Rahul was finishing off the last few with his big hammer. Boy, what a sight. How many did you get, Rahul?" The smith shrugged, a sheepish look on his face. 23. Alex whistled. "Anyway, it was mostly done by the time I arrived, and Claire had already started helping the wounded. They sent me on to the school where, well, you know the rest." They fell into easy chat after that, the swapping of war stories essential to processing the trauma they'd all suffered. "So," said Marley finally, "it's late and I think it's time we wrap this up. Joshua, are you sure you won't stay?" He stared into the fire for nearly a full minute as their eyes fell on him. "You aren't stroking out on me, are you, Gramps?" asked Kit. He smiled. "No, thanks for the offer, but I'll be moving on tomorrow, and this time it'll be for good." There was movement beyond the circle of the fire, and Ragland looked up in time to see Claire walking away. "Excuse me," he mumbled, and shot up from the log, heading after her. "Claire, wait, please," he called, running to catch up to her. She stopped, but didn't turn around until he put a hand on her upper arm. "So even after all this, you're still going?" she asked. He nodded, then did something that shocked him as much as it did her. He pulled her into an embrace and kissed her. Even more surprising, she kissed him back. Long-absent feelings rose inside him as they kissed, and when they finally parted, both panting for breath, he leaned his forehead against hers. "Come with me." She pushed him gently away so she could look into his eyes. "You know I can't." "Why?" "I'm the town medic, the only one qualified. You stay." "I can't. I'm a rambling man, Claire. I need to keep moving, but I want you by my side." In a stalemate, they stared at each other before Claire finally spoke. "Tell you what. You go and ramble around the countryside. But I want you to come back in a year. In the meantime, I'll train someone up. Kit has expressed an interest, so maybe her. That'll give us both a year to think about what we want. If you are tired of your wandering and still want me, you stay. If you aren't tired of it and I still want you, and I have someone to take over, I'll come with you. If you don't come back, well, I guess I'll have my answer." He grinned like a schoolboy who just found out his crush likes him. "Deal," he said, thrusting out his hand. Claire, also smiling, batted his hand away and pulled him in for another kiss. Marley made Ragland a breakfast of bacon, eggs, and toast, and a steaming mug of black coffee.
That really is the last of Simon's supply, so think yourself lucky.
He raised his mug. You didn't need to do this, but thank you.
It's nothing. Where did you race off to last night? And what time did you get in? She asked, a glint in her eyes.
He shrugged, a coy smile on his face.
Fair enough.
Marley cleaned up the breakfast dishes as he went upstairs to collect his pack and weapons.
I'll see you to the door. I won't come and see you off. Too much to do, she said quietly.
Ragland paused on the doorstep, then turned and drew Marley into a hug. Take care, Marley.
You too, old man, she said gruffly.
Her eyes glistened.
Drop in if you're ever in the neighborhood.
I might just do that, he said. So long. She closed the door and he sighed gently. He was halfway to the gate when a familiar figure emerged from a side street. It was David leading his horse. He turned when he saw Ragland and headed his way. He hadn't seen much of his nemesis since the battle. He stopped and waited, every nerve in his body jangling, ready to meet any aggression with extreme prejudice. David walked right up to him, but instead of aggression, he offered the reins of his horse to him. Ragland, his hand still by his side, raised both eyebrows. I want you to have her, the hunter said, as payment for all the trouble I caused you. I don't need a horse. Need? Probably not, but she'll make your life a hell of a lot easier. He shook the reins. Please, no tricks. She's yours, saddle and all, my way of saying sorry. Ragland had had a horse briefly in the second year of the after days, and it had certainly made traveling a lot easier and faster. He'd been on the lookout for one ever since, but had only come across wild ones, and he was no horsebreaker. He weighed up the man in front of him and decided on this occasion at least he was being genuine. Ragland was a man who might forgive eventually, but he certainly didn't forget. He took the reins and nodded. I'll take payment, but not the apology, he said. Some things can't be made right with a sorry. He began to lead the horse away, calling over his shoulder as he went. What's her name? Reliable. Well, David, Reliable and I'll be back in a year. In the meantime, make things right with Marley. I don't want to have to kill you. He waited for a smart-ass reply from David that didn't come. The Bakerstown local just stared after him, his face devoid of expression. At the gate, Ragland was provided with one last surprise. Nearly the whole town was congregated and clapping as he led Reliable down the last stretch of avenue to the gates that had been freshly repaired by Rahul Charlie and a few other willing hands. Ragland shook his head, blushing at the fuss, but waved anyway. At the gate, he paused in front of the core group minus Marley and Claire, but this time including Viola. There were more heartfelt goodbyes and hugs, Ragland wincing at a few misplaced claps on his still smarting shoulder. Thanks again, Viola, he said when he reached her. How are you feeling?
Oh, I'm fine, she said, waving the question away and hugging him tightly. I'll miss you in the fields, old-timer. You have a job any time you want to come back, you hear?
He chuckled. I'll keep it in mind. Odin ducked out from behind her and grabbed Ragland's hand before he could move on. Odin, I wondered where you were, he said, returning the vigorous handshake. You look after Viola, okay?
I will, Mr. Ragland.
Alex and Kit were the last in the line, and he hugged Alex before reaching out to hug Kit.
Not yet, Gramps, she said, pointing a thumb over her shoulder. I have a going-away gift that I want to give you in private.
She avoided his gaze and headed towards the gate without looking back to make sure he was following. He shrugged and gave the crowd one more wave, his eyes seeking out the one person who had said their goodbye the night before. He found Claire well back and standing apart from the crowd, with her arms folded. With a knowing smile, he gave a wave. She returned it with one of her own, and then turned and began walking back up the avenue. Ragland gave one more wave to the rest and began leading Reliable after Kit. Safe travels, Joshua Ragland, boomed Simon as he went through the gate.
I'm going to walk you to the lodge, said Kit when he caught up to her.
You don't have to.
I want to.
Okay, that would be nice, kid. There were no words between them the whole way, the kind of easy silence that only friends could share without feeling awkward, and certainly different to how it had been when they first met. Finally, the old road leveled out into a sweeping curve revealing the hunter's lodge. It looked like an old Christmas card, with snow packed on the cabin roof and smoke spiraling from the chimney. Kit led the way over the bridge and stopped on the other side, turning and waiting as Ragland and Reliable made their way across. Kit approached Ragland, her eyes set and purposeful as he pulled the horse to a halt.
Open your hand.
Ragland did as she asked and held out his right hand, palm up. Kit pulled something from her pocket and dropped it into his hand. It was the onyx necklace. He opened his mouth to protest, but she held up her hand.
I don't need this anymore, she said. It's done its job, but it's yours, and you'll need its protection now.
Ragland stared down at the necklace, then back to Kit. She stood on tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek.
When you look at it, it shouldn't remind you of loss. It should remind you of life, and that there's more to this than just surviving.
He nodded, not trusting himself to speak as his eyes welled up. Kit smiled, wiping a tear away.
This cold stings the eyes, huh?
He laughed and pulled her into a bear hug. Stay safe, kid. I'll be seeing you. Ragland put his foot in the stirrup and heaved himself onto the saddle.
You better,
she called, as he shook the reins and began trotting away on his new steed. He looked over his shoulder with a grin. Count on it. Epilogue. On a clear, sunny day 6 weeks later, Ragland halted Reliable beneath a peeling and weathered road sign. Welcome to New Hampshire. Live free or die. While he knew the motto of the Granite State predated the fall by many years, it was certainly prophetic. He didn't linger long. He wanted to find a suitable campsite and hunt while there was still light. 2 hours and 9 miles later, he was spit roasting a chicken of all things. He hadn't had chicken in what seemed like 100 years, and the aroma of the cooking meat and skin made his mouth water. He'd set his camp 400 yards off the highway in a shallow glade and hadn't even bothered with his tent. Late in the afternoon, the day had turned overcast, and the clouds bottled in the unseasonable warmth but didn't threaten rain. A light blanket would do for the night. He'd finished the chicken and buried what was left when he heard a sound on the wind. It was faint, but it sounded like a woman's laugh. It was as brief as it was unexpected, and Ragland cocked his head, trying to work out if he'd heard it or imagined it. A minute later, he was about to dismiss it as his imagination when he heard another sound, what could only be conversation. He quickly stamped out his fire and picked up his bow, darting into the trees and heading towards the highway he'd traveled that day. He didn't want trouble, but it always paid to know who one might be sharing the road with. He drew closer to the roadway and settled low in the shadows of the trees to observe. From the even tone of the quiet conversation, it appeared they hadn't spotted the smoke of his fire. Still, his heartbeat was fast as he waited for the group to appear. They did after another minute. It was a group of 7, 2 men, 3 women, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. One of the men was wheeling a barrow, its inflated tires silent on the cracked tarmac. What a strange group to see traveling at night, Ragland thought to himself, but no threat. The thought had barely manifested when he felt a cold edge of steel pressed hard against his throat. I'm not going to hurt you, dude, said a low voice behind him, but I need you to put your hands behind your head nice and slow and interlace your fingers, got it? Angry at the ease with which he'd been snuck up on, Ragland swallowed. There was no way out. Yet. Got it, he rasped before doing as he'd been ordered. Good. Now stand up slowly. Ragland obeyed, and when he was on his feet, his assailant pressed something hard into his back, then took the blade away. That's a .44 Magnum right over your spine. I won't use it unless you make me, understood? Ragland nodded. The man whistled loudly, and the conversation of the group stopped as they came to a halt and looked around expectantly. Okay, we're walking out onto the road, nice and easy, the man said, and gave him a gentle shove between the shoulders. The eyes of the group fell on Ragland as he emerged with his captor. In their faces he saw only fear and mistrust, no aggression. That was a positive. 10 feet from the group, his captor clamped something hard over his shoulder, bringing him to a stop. Are you armed? Just my bow and a knife in my boot. Good. Slip the bow off and let it fall to the ground, the unseen man said, plucking the 3 arrows in his quiver free. This guy is careful, Ragland thought grudgingly, dropping his hand briefly to let the bow fall. Okay, with your left hand, pull out the knife holding the end of the handle with the tips of your finger and thumb, nice and slow, and drop it too. Ragland bent over and pulled out the knife handmade by Rahul many months before. When he was done, he put his hands back on his head. The muzzle against his back was removed, but the object on his shoulder was pressed down firmly as a big hand made quick work of patting him down. Suddenly, the pressure on his shoulder disappeared, and he heard the man step away. Okay, you can put your hands down now, but don't try anything. Ragland slowly lowered his hands as the man stepped around and came into view. His captor was an impressive sight, at least 2 inches taller than Ragland. He was big and lanky without being skinny. He had red hair and a darker beard. Over his shoulder, the drifter could see the well-worn handle of an axe, and against his chest, in slits through a leather strap over his other shoulder, were 3 throwing knives. Moonlight glinted off the steel of the hook where the man's left hand should have been. You're an old one, the big man said, his eyes widening. What's your name? Ragland locked eyes with him. What's it matter? His stare was met evenly. I'm just being polite. That's why I didn't ask your age. The answer drew a grunt of real amusement from Ragland. Fair enough. My name's Joshua Ragland. Okay, Joshua Ragland. My name's Luke Merritt. Pleased to meet you. The end. This has been The Drifter, an America Falls novel. Written by Scott Medbury, narrated by Mike Manns.